Okay, wow. This is quite the collection of sources you sent our way. It looks like you're really on a mission to trying to figure out this whole freedom and happiness thing in a world that feels, well, pretty complex.
Yeah, no kidding. You've got, let's see, human psychology, societal pressures, even the meaning of life is in here.
It's pretty amazing, actually. I'm seeing some interesting themes emerging. This idea of overcoming fear keeps popping up. And challenging conventional wisdom. Oh, and finding freedom in some really unexpected places.
Yeah.
A lot of this stuff seems to connect to Adlerian psychology. You're familiar with that?
Oh yeah, definitely. Adlerian psychology is it's a really powerful framework for understanding, well, this human experience, I guess. It was developed by Alfred Adler, and it really emphasizes that, we have the power to shape our own lives.
So we're not just like products of our past experiences.
Not entirely, no. It's not that Adlerian psychology ignores the past. It just focuses more on how we interpret those experiences and how we use them to move towards our goals. So instead of getting stuck in the why of what happened, it's more about the what we're aiming for now. That's where teleology comes in.
Teleology, that sounds a bit academic. Can you break that down a bit?
Oh, it's actually simpler than it sounds. Teleology basically means we're driven by our future aspirations, rather than being totally determined by past events. Like when you set a destination on your GPS, you're focused on where you want to go, not on every single turn you took to get to your starting point.
Okay, I see. So it's like we're constantly creating our present and future based on the goals we choose to pursue.
You got it. It's about understanding that we actually have a say in shaping our reality. There's a great analogy in one of your sources about well water. So the water itself stays at a pretty consistent temperature, right? But it can feel warmer or cooler depending on the time of year. So our perception changes, even if the objective reality doesn't.
That's such a clear way to picture it. It really shows how our subjective experience, the meaning we give to things, shapes how we see the world.
Right, like take someone who stays inside all the time, maybe because of social anxiety. An Adlerian perspective would be that they're not trapped by their past, but they're actively choosing to stay indoors because they see the outside world as dangerous.
So they've kind of created this world where staying inside feels safer, even if it limits them in other ways.
Exactly. It doesn't mean their anxiety isn't real, of course. It just helps to understand that their behavior is actually fulfilling a goal, even if it's unconscious. They're actively, well, maybe unintentionally, shaping their reality.
This ties into another big theme I'm noticing in these sources. This whole idea of feeling inferior. It seems like everyone feels inadequate sometimes. We're always comparing ourselves to others. It's like a constant struggle.
It really is. Adler believed that striving for a sense of competence is a natural human thing. But it should be directed toward self-improvement, not competition with other people. When we're constantly comparing ourselves, it usually just leads to feeling bad, It's like we're always looking over our shoulder instead of focusing on our own path.
Instead of celebrating what we're good at, we're just like stacking ourselves up against some idealized version of somebody else.
Exactly. One source had a great example. Like, imagine comparing yourself to, say, some super successful entrepreneur while totally ignoring your own unique talents and accomplishments. That kind of comparison is just setting yourself up to feel inferior.
We forget that everybody's on their own path with different starting points and resources. It's like comparing apples and oranges, right? It's not even a fair comparison in the first place.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And, Adler would argue that despite those differences, we're all fundamentally equal. It's about creating what he called horizontal relationships, where nobody feels superior or inferior, but just, equal partners in this whole human experience.
So that's a powerful idea. So if we're all fundamentally equal, what does that mean for this whole idea of wanting to be liked, seeking approval from others? Some of your sources had some, well, pretty radical things to say about it.
Oh yeah, for sure. This is where it gets really interesting. We talk about freedom a lot, but one source actually defined freedom as, get this, being disliked by other people. That might sound kind of shocking at first, right?
It definitely goes against everything we're taught about, fitting in and being likable. I'm curious though, why would being disliked be a path to freedom?
Well, think about it. If we're always trying to please everybody and get their approval, we end up living by their expectations. Instead of pursuing our own path, our authentic selves, it's like we're giving our power away,
So by trying so hard to be liked, we're letting other people dictate our choices, define our worth.
Exactly. Like you're handing over the steering wheel of your life and letting someone else choose where you go. One source had a really good example of this. It was about a student who chose a career path to please their parents. but ended up feeling completely miserable and unfulfilled. It's like the classic story of sacrificing your own desires for external validation.
It's so common, though, isn't it? Trying to live up to someone else's expectations instead of honoring our own, I don't know, inner compass or something.
It really is. And Adler talks about this concept of the separation of tasks. It's all about understanding which problems are ours to solve and which ones belong to other people.
Oh yeah, there was a great example in one of the sources about a parent whose kid is refusing to study. And naturally, the parent wants to fix it, but ultimately it's the child's responsibility to engage with their education. The parent can offer support, guidance, but they can't actually force the kid to learn.
That's a perfect illustration. It's about respecting each other's autonomy, understanding the limits of our influence. And it actually ties back into the idea of freedom, too. The parent is free from the burden of a responsibility that doesn't belong to them, and the child is free to, learn and grow at their own pace.
I like that. So how do we apply this separation of tasks idea in, everyday life? It's easy to get caught up in other people's dramas, especially with people we're close to. Where do we draw the line?
You're right, it's tough. One source used this analogy of the Gordian knot. It was this crazy complex knot that nobody could figure out how to untie until Alexander the Great just sliced right through it.
So we're supposed to channel our inner Alexander the Great when it comes to relationships.
Not literally, of course.
Yeah.
But the analogy is that sometimes the best way to deal with a messy situation is a clean break. Recognizing that a problem isn't ours to solve can be incredibly freeing.
So setting boundaries, respecting each other's choices, and focusing on what we can actually control.
Exactly. And speaking of control, one thing that holds a lot of people back from real freedom is this fear of getting hurt in relationships. The fear of betrayal. We're always told to trust people, but that can feel super risky.
Yeah.
Your sources definitely had a lot to say about trust.
Oh yeah, for sure. And to be honest, I get a little nervous when people talk about blind trust. It feels, kind of naive, like setting yourself up for disappointment. What does Adlerian psychology say about all this?
Well, one of the sources makes this really important distinction between trust and confidence. So trust is conditional. It's based on security or proof. Think of a lender asking for collateral before they give you a loan.
Right.
But confidence, that's unconditional. It's a belief in the other person, just as they are, in their inherent worth.
So that friend who believes in your potential and offers support, no strings attached. That's powerful stuff. Believing in someone, even when they might not believe in themselves.
Exactly. And building that kind of confidence in other people, even when there's a risk of getting hurt, it's crucial for creating deep and fulfilling relationships. It's a shift from a mindset of fear and self-protection to openness and generosity.
So it's not naive to choose to have confidence in people.
Not at all. It's about choosing to believe in their goodness, in their potential. But, and this is important, confidence doesn't mean being a doormat, or tolerating bad behavior.
Right. It's about approaching relationships with an open heart, but also setting boundaries and protecting yourself when you need to.
Exactly. And it's interesting because having confidence in others can actually inspire them to live up to that belief.
Because they feel seen and believed in.
Yeah.
And that creates a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah, it's a powerful force. But it's still important to, choose who you let into your life and to set boundaries when you need to. It all goes back to that separation of tasks we were talking about. You have the right to choose who you let into your life and to set boundaries when you need to.
This makes me think about another big theme in these sources, this idea of contributing to something larger than ourselves. A lot of what we've been talking about seems to be pointing toward finding meaning and purpose through service to others.
Yeah, that's definitely a core principle in Adlerian psychology. The idea that true happiness comes from feeling like you're contributing to something bigger than yourself. One source used a really simple example about a mom who finds joy in making a meal for her family. It's not like a grand gesture that society would necessarily celebrate, but it's an act of love, an act of service.
It's a great example of how those small, everyday things can be so meaningful. It doesn't have to be about saving the world or making these huge, grand gestures. It's about those quiet, consistent acts of love and kindness.
Exactly. It's about recognizing our inherent value and finding ways to share our unique gifts with the world. And it doesn't have to mean self-sacrifice or neglecting your own needs. It's about finding that balance where you're fulfilling your potential and making a positive impact.
So not becoming a martyr, but finding ways to express your unique talents in service to others.
You said it perfectly. Although one source did offer a word of caution about workaholism, pointing out that working too much can actually be a way to avoid dealing with deeper issues, especially in relationships.
Ah, so even though work can be a really powerful way to contribute, it's important to make sure it's not a way to escape intimacy and connection. Like finding fulfillment at work is great, but not if it comes at the expense of other important things in life.
Exactly. It's all about balance. Which brings us to another really fascinating idea that came up: how we experience life itself. One source suggested that we should focus on living in the present moment instead of constantly chasing future goals or dwelling on the past. They actually use this beautiful analogy of dancing without a destination.
I love that. It's like just enjoying the movement, the music of the dance. Rather than being fixated on getting to a specific step or formation, it's about being present in the experience, right?
Right. Yes, exactly. The source actually made a distinction between what they call a kinetic life and an energial life. So a kinetic life is all about goals, striving for an endpoint. But an energial life, it embraces the process, the present moment, the energy it evokes.
So instead of being so focused on achieving goals, we can find joy in the journey itself. We'll get to part 2 of this episode after a quick break.
Yeah, that's it, isn't it? It really is all about the journey. And speaking of journeys, one of the things that really stood out to me in these sources was this idea of how we frame our experiences. Like, it's really connected to that concept of teleology we were talking about.
You mean how our perspective kind of shapes our reality?
Exactly. Like, one source had this really simple example of two people who both went through their parents getting divorced when they were young. So that event, that fact is objectively the same for both of them, right?
That's like that. Well, water.
Yeah.
Same temperature,
Yeah.
but different experience depending on, the season.
Right. But how each person feels about the divorce, how they let it impact their lives, that's totally subjective. One person might see it as like this huge tragedy, a sign that love is doomed or something. The other might see it as a necessary step for their parents to find happiness on their own. And those two different interpretations are going to lead to totally different outcomes in their lives.
So it's not about pretending the divorce didn't happen or anything. It's more about choosing how we want to kind of integrate that experience into our understanding of the world and of ourselves.
Exactly. It's about understanding that we have a choice in how we frame our experiences, which actually leads to another really powerful idea from Adlerian psychology, this idea that we can actually choose our emotions.
Hold on, wait a minute, choose our emotions.
Really?
Our emotions just feel so automatic, like they're totally out of our control.
I know, it sounds kind of crazy, right? But think about it this way. Our emotions aren't random. They're not just happening to us. They actually serve a purpose. They're signals. They're telling us something about our relationship to ourselves and to the world around us.
Okay, so instead of feeling like we're victims of our emotions, we can actually learn to listen to them. Like understand what they're trying to tell us. And then what? Choose how we want to respond.
Exactly. One of the sources used the example of anger. So anger is often a sign that we feel like our boundaries have been crossed or that we're not being respected.
So instead of just like lashing out or suppressing the anger, we could use it as an opportunity to communicate our needs more clearly, or maybe even reevaluate the relationship altogether.
That's a great point. We can choose to respond to anger in a way that's constructive instead of letting it control us. And it's the same for other emotions too, like sadness, fear, anxiety. They're not bad in and of themselves.
It's about honoring our emotions while also recognizing that we have a choice in how we respond to them. Like they're giving us valuable data that we can use to make better decisions in our lives.
That's a great way to put it. And this all ties back to one of the most central themes in Adlerian psychology, this whole concept of freedom.
We've talked about freedom in a lot of different ways. Choosing our own path, letting go of the need for recognition, even being disliked. But what does it actually mean to experience true freedom?
One of your sources had this really bold definition. They said that freedom is being disliked by other people. I know that sounds kind of counterintuitive, especially in a world that puts so much emphasis on fitting in and being popular.
It definitely goes against the grain. Why would being disliked be a path to freedom?
Well, think about it this way. If we're constantly trying to please everyone, we end up letting their expectations control our lives. We basically become prisoners of their opinions.
So busy trying to get their approval that we lose sight of our own true selves.
Exactly. True freedom means having the courage to be ourselves, even if it means not being liked by everyone. And it doesn't mean being intentionally provocative or offensive or anything like that.
Right. It's not about going out of our way to be disagreeable. It's more about making sure our actions are aligned with our values, even if those values aren't shared by everyone around us.
Yes. One of the sources told a story about this student who had a really intense fear of blushing in public. She would avoid social situations because she was so afraid of being judged.
That sounds really tough. I can only imagine how limiting that would be.
It was, and she went to someone for advice. And you know what they told her? They said, "Fear of blushing is easy to cure, but I will not cure it."
Wait, why wouldn't they help her? That seems kind of harsh.
Well, it might seem that way on the surface, but the person giving the advice recognized that her fear was actually serving a purpose. It was protecting her in a way,
Yeah.
keeping her safe in this very limited world.
So by refusing to offer a quick fix, they were actually challenging her to confront the root of the problem, not just the symptom. They were pushing her to step outside of her comfort zone.
Exactly. They were basically saying, you have a choice. You can stay trapped by your fear, or you can choose freedom, even if it feels scary. It's a really powerful example of how facing our fears instead of avoiding them can lead to a much deeper sense of freedom.
Freedom often means embracing discomfort and uncertainty.
That's right. And another key to experiencing freedom is understanding that concept of separating tasks that we talked about earlier.
We talked about it in terms of parents and kids, but how does it apply to freedom more broadly?
Well, separating tasks means understanding that we're only truly responsible for our own thoughts, feelings, and actions. We can't control how other people respond to us.
So if someone chooses to dislike us, that's their issue, not ours. We can't force them to change their mind.
You got it. We can't make someone like us no matter how hard we try. In fact, trying to force it can often backfire. One of the sources used the analogy of, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink.
That's so true. We can offer kindness and understanding, but ultimately it's up to them how they receive it. Their choice is their own.
Exactly. And letting go of that need to control how others perceive us is a huge step toward experiencing true freedom.
It sounds like freedom is all about focusing on what we can control, our own choices and responses, and letting go of the things that are outside of our influence.
Yes. And that brings us to another really crucial concept from Adlerian psychology, this idea of building confidence in others.
We talked about confidence in terms of relationships, but how does it connect to this bigger idea of freedom?
Well, confidence in others is obviously essential for building healthy relationships, but it's also a key ingredient for creating a more just and compassionate world. If we don't believe in people, we're less likely to give them opportunities to grow and change.
We might withhold our support or limit their potential because we don't trust that they can make positive choices.
That's right. One source made a really clear distinction between trust and confidence. So trust is conditional. It's based on security or proof, but confidence is unconditional. It's a belief in someone's inherent worth, regardless of their past mistakes or their current circumstances.
It's like that friend who believes in you even when you don't believe in yourself. That kind of unwavering support can be so powerful.
Exactly, and it can be incredibly transformative. It can give people the courage to step into their own power and create positive change. It's about seeing their potential even when they can't see it themselves.
But honestly, how do we build that kind of confidence in others, especially when we've been hurt or betrayed in the past?
It's definitely not easy. It takes courage and a willingness to be vulnerable, especially when we've experienced pain in relationships. But it starts with recognizing that everyone is on their own journey, and we all make mistakes.
It's about extending grace and compassion even when it's hard.
You got it. It's about choosing to see the best in people, even when they're not showing it to us. It's about offering a hand of friendship, even when we're not sure if it will be accepted.
It's a beautiful way to approach the world, but it also takes a lot of courage and a deep belief in the inherent goodness of others.
It does. And that act of faith, that belief in someone, can be incredibly powerful. It shows them that they're worthy of love and respect, even if they don't feel it themselves.
So building confidence in others isn't about making them feel good. It's about empowering them to make positive choices and create positive change.
You said it perfectly. And that actually leads us to another really crucial element of freedom, this idea of contribution.
We've been talking about contribution throughout this conversation, but how does it fit into this larger picture of freedom, meaning, and happiness?
Adlerian psychology suggests that true happiness comes from this sense of contributing to something larger than ourselves. It's about using our unique talents and gifts to make a positive impact. And it doesn't have to be about grand gestures or saving the world.
So it could be as simple as helping a neighbor or volunteering in our community or even just being a good friend or family member.
Exactly. One of the sources gave a great example, this mother who finds joy in preparing a meal for her family. It's not a heroic act in the eyes of the world, but it's an act of love and service.
It's about finding meaning and purpose in the everyday, in those ordinary acts of kindness and generosity.
That's it. It's about recognizing that even small acts can have a big impact.
This is all so inspiring. But I have to admit, it can be hard to find the time and energy to contribute when we're all so caught up in our own busy lives.
I get it. It definitely takes a conscious effort to shift our focus from what's in it for me to how can I help? But it really starts with cultivating a sense of awareness, being present in our lives, paying attention to the needs of the people around us, asking ourselves, how can I be of service?
It's like training ourselves to look for opportunities to contribute rather than waiting for them to just show up.
And it's amazing how many opportunities you'll start to notice once you start looking. And contribution doesn't have to mean becoming a martyr or neglecting your own needs either.
Right. It's about finding that balance between fulfilling our own potential and serving something larger than ourselves.
Exactly. It's about creating a win-win situation where everyone benefits. And this idea of contribution actually ties back to that concept of building horizontal relationships we were talking about earlier. It's about seeing ourselves as equal partners in this journey of life and supporting each other along the way.
It's like we're all weaving a tapestry together. Each individual thread contributes to the beauty and the strength of the whole.
What a beautiful image. And as we cultivate those qualities of self-acceptance and confidence in others and a spirit of contribution, we not only experience greater freedom and happiness in our own lives, but we also inspire those around us to do the same.
This has been such a powerful conversation so far. I'm feeling incredibly inspired, and I'm eager to keep exploring these ideas in more depth. But for now, let's shift gears a little and talk about some of the more practical aspects of actually putting these concepts into action. Sound good?
Yeah, sounds good to me. Let's get practical. It's funny, as we've been talking about all these big kind of heady concepts, freedom, responsibility, contribution, I keep thinking about how they actually play out, in our everyday lives. It's often the little things that make the biggest difference, you know what I mean?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Sometimes the simplest interaction can totally shift things, but we don't even realize it's happening. What are you thinking of?
Well, one of these sources, it really made me rethink something I always thought was positive. Praise. They were suggesting that praising someone, even though it seems harmless, can actually be a form of, low-key manipulation.
Whoa, hold on. Really? I've always thought of praise as a good thing. How could it be manipulative?
The source was pointing out that praise often comes from a place of, superiority. It creates this kind of vertical relationship between the person giving the praise and the person receiving it.
Oh, like a parent praising a child for doing something that's expected of them.
Right, exactly. It can reinforce a power dynamic.
Yeah.
And make the person on the receiving end feel like they need that approval to feel good about themselves. And, that dynamic doesn't just disappear when we become adults.
So if we're always looking for praise from other people, we're basically giving them power over our self-worth.
You got it. It's like we're saying, hey, I need you to tell me I'm okay. And, the same goes for criticism, too.
Right. It's a way to control people, make them conform to our expectations. I'm starting to see how even these seemingly harmless things can be problematic. So if praise and criticism aren't the best approaches, what is? What's the alternative?
Well, these sources were suggesting a more horizontal approach based on encouragement and gratitude. So instead of praising a kid for cleaning their room, we might say, thank you for helping me keep our home tidy. It really makes a difference.
It is subtle, but it feels so different, doesn't it? More like a partnership, less like a power struggle.
Exactly. And it encourages the kid to, find their own internal motivation to do things because they understand the value of their actions, not just to please someone else.
It reminds me of that inner geo-life idea we were talking about. Finding joy in the process, not just focusing on external rewards.
It's all connected, isn't it? And speaking of connections, this whole conversation has really highlighted how powerful relationships are. Adlerian psychology seems to put a lot of emphasis on having healthy, supportive connections with other people.
For sure. That's a big theme throughout all these sources. But building those kinds of relationships, it takes effort, right? Where do you even begin?
Well, one of the sources had this quote that really struck me. It said, if I change, the world will change.
Wow. That's a pretty bold statement.
Yeah.
It's like saying that personal transformation is the key to a better world.
It is. It all starts with us, you know? Adlerian psychology is all about taking responsibility for our own happiness, our own well-being. We can't control other people or, all the stuff that happens around us, but we can control how we respond to it.
So it's about focusing on what we can influence, our own thoughts, feelings, actions.
Exactly. And as we work on things like self-acceptance, having confidence in other people, and, that willingness to contribute, we naturally start to create a more positive ripple effect around us.
It's like that physics thing,
Yeah.
Every action has an equal and opposite reaction. Our choices matter, even the small ones.
They really do. Speaking of impact, remember that whole life lie concept we touched on earlier? Those ways we sometimes kind of trick ourselves to avoid uncomfortable stuff?
Oh yeah, that was an eye-opener.
It was for me, for sure. And one common life lie is this belief that, our past determines our future. It's so easy to get stuck in those old patterns and just assume that things will always be a certain way. But Adlerian psychology says, no, you can choose a different path.
We have the power to rewrite the story, basically.
Exactly. We can focus on our strengths, learn new skills, and create a future that actually reflects what matters most to us.
That's incredibly powerful. I mean, it takes courage to break free from those old patterns and really embrace the unknown. But the possibility of creating a better life, a more meaningful life, it's worth the risk, right?
Totally. And it's not about becoming a different person or trying to be perfect or anything. It's about accepting who you are, imperfections and all.
That's such a good point. Self-acceptance, not self-improvement. It's about recognizing that we are enough, just as we are. And from that place, that place of self-acceptance, that's where we can really step into the world and make a difference.
Couldn't have said it better myself. It really is a beautiful and powerful journey. And it starts with that decision, the decision to step into your own power and embrace the freedom to create the life you truly desire.
This whole deep dive has been amazing. We've covered so much. Understanding the power of choice, separating tasks, building confidence in others, finding meaning through contribution. It's a lot to take in. But as we wrap things up here, I'm curious, what's the one message that really sticks with you from all of this?
That's a good question. For me, it's that reminder that happiness, it's not a destination, it's a choice. It's not something we find out there in the world. It's an inside job. It's about cultivating self-acceptance, gratitude, generosity. It's about choosing to live in the present moment with purpose and joy.
That's a beautiful way to put it. Happiness is a choice we make every day. And, as you were talking, I was thinking about that question of meaning, too. It's something so many people grapple with. And the sources you brought in, they offer a really unique perspective on it.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Adler believed that life itself, just as it is, doesn't actually have inherent meaning. It's up to each of us to create meaning in our own lives, which might sound kind of daunting at first, but it's also really empowering, don't you think?
Absolutely. It means we're not bound by some, predetermined fate or destiny. We have the freedom to choose what matters to us, what our values are, and to create a life that reflects that.
And that meaning so often comes through our connections with other people, the ways we contribute, the ways we touch each other's lives. It's about understanding that we're all connected and our choices matter. They have ripple effects that go way beyond ourselves.
This has been such an inspiring conversation. I'm so grateful for the opportunity to explore all this with you. I know I'll be thinking about it for a long time.
Me too. It's always such a pleasure to dive into this stuff and see all the possibilities for living a more fulfilling, meaningful life.
And to you, our listener, we leave you with this final thought. If the world changes when you change, what kind of world do you want to create?